Here's your next challenge. Define an assumption. First definition that someone gave is it's an implicit premise. That is the most concise, and it is a correct definition of an assumption. An assumption is an implicit, in other words, it's an unstated premise. It was never stated in the argument, right? So in a role question, if they ask you, what role does that thing play? And they say that's an assumption, there could be some odd exceptions. And I think there might be one or two, but they're odd for different reasons. That can't be correct because an assumption is unstated, right? But it's also a premise. In other words, it's going to help the argument. So all flawed arguments are making assumptions. They're leaving premises out. So the premises provided aren't sufficient to prove that argument, and therefore that conclusion is flawed, or that argument is flawed because the conclusion is not proven. Another definition that someone wrote here is something that's accepted as true. It's something that the author accepts as true. So it's an unstated premise, yes. Okay, an assumption, an unstated premise which is not supported by relevant facts or premises. It's true that no premises have been provided in support of it, but it may be some assumptions are totally reasonable. Everyone would agree with them. So for example, if I said to you, on Wednesday, John told that he was going to be fired the next day, right? Therefore, John was told that he will be fired on Thursday. Well, that argument is assuming that Thursday comes after Wednesday, but no one would really disagree with that. So that's an assumption, but it's so reasonable that, it's not really up for debate, but it still is an assumption. And most would consider that okay. Josh, one thing you said about an assumption, sorry to call you out on this. I didn't mean to do that. But anyway, something not stated but required for a conclusion. What you've just defined there is actually a necessary assumption. And this is something that a lot of people get mixed up. Assumptions are just unstated premises. But then, of course, the LSAT is testing two kinds of assumptions. One is necessary assumptions and one is sufficient assumptions. So what you've just defined there is a necessary assumption. Let's take a half second and just define those two things. So in your mind, guys, write down what you think a necessary assumption is versus a sufficient assumption. That can be a little harder to articulate, but give it your best shot. By the way, strengthening questions the correct answers tend to be neither necessary nor sufficient, but they are assumptions that help the argument. The first one, necessary assumption is something that the author must agree with, and if false, will destroy the argument. Yeah, that's correct. A necessary assumption is necessary for the conclusion to make any sense. In other words, if that claim is no longer true, if that assumption is not true, then the conclusion will fall apart. That is the definition of necessary. That said, the necessary assumption will not necessarily prove the conclusion. Like you need it, but it won't necessarily get you all the way to the conclusion. So the argument still could be flawed, even if you make that necessary assumption and everybody agrees to it. A sufficient assumption proves the conclusion. Yes, that is correct. Now, one thing about that is that because the sufficient assumption proves the conclusion, in other words, if you take the argument, let's say the argument has two premises and a conclusion. Well, right now, the two premises are not sufficient. They're not enough to prove the conclusion. But if you add in a sufficient assumption, it, along with the other two premises, will now be sufficient or enough to prove the conclusion. If that sufficient assumption that you add to the argument is overly strong, in other words, it says things that we don't need it to say, that's okay. Some people get rid of the correct answer in sufficient assumption questions because they're like, whoa, that's way too extreme. Doesn't matter. If it now guarantees that the conclusion has to be true, I don't care how strong it is correct, it's sufficient. So sufficient, one way to think about sufficient assumptions is that they are enough or more than enough, whereas necessary assumptions are enough or less than enough. But no matter what, they have to be required. That can also be confusing because sometimes the correct answer is both necessary and sufficient. It's like a perfect gap filler. And so then people are like, oh yeah, look at that necessary assumption. And it's like, yeah, but it's also sufficient. Another definition, a necessary assumption is something that the author has to agree with. Yes, the author has to agree with it because if it were not true, the conclusion would fall apart. Sufficient assumption builds a bridge between premises and conclusion. This happens a lot, but the problem with looking at sufficient assumptions in this way is that sometimes you narrowly look for just something that like connects them perfectly. Whereas, as I was just saying, the sufficient assumption could be a lot bigger and do a lot more than just connect the premises to the conclusion. It could like prove the conclusion 10 times over and it would still be correct.